Hey everybody, welcome to chapter 3. I've missed being in front of you guys in the classroom, and so I've arranged to actually be in a classroom tonight so I could talk to you guys about this exciting chapter. In this chapter, we talk about the politics behind America's founding. Basically, the whole idea here is how do we get our form of government? You guys, we've already talked about different forms of government, and most of you said that if you had to choose today what our form of government would be, that you would do the same thing that our founding fathers did back in 1787. Well, how did they do that? How did they figure this out? So we're going to talk about that kind of background and history, and with that we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence, the Revolutionary War, just a little bit, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention, the Ratification Battle, and with that specifically, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, and the Federalist Papers. So let's kind of get started and get this ball rolling. First, think Wayne's World, let's do the time warp. We're going to kind of go back in history. Who were the delegates to the Constitutional Convention? What did they know? So first off, as I've already talked to you, the Constitutional Convention really had about 55 delegates, usually 30 at any given point in time. Who were they? Were they men? Were they women? Were they a diverse body? Well, we've already talked about it. Spoiler alert, they were a bunch of rich white men. Is that bad? Not necessarily, but it's just something to be aware of in comparison to what we would have today. They were the nation's elite, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. They were probably pretty much what we consider the 1% today. Were some of them slaveholders? Yes. Were some of them anti-slavery advocates? Yes. Were some of them industrialists in the North? Were some of them plantation owners in the South? Yes. All of them wanted freedom from England. They were unified with that, but once that happened, what did they have together? What did they have in common? What were they going to agree upon for us going forward? Now, going back to this, so we have nation's elite, slaveholders, and anti-slavery advocates. With the nation's elite, you know, there's a lot in the Constitution and a lot in your textbook and other textbooks about what motivated the constitutional founders. Was it money? Was it economics? Well, quite frankly, with the Articles of Confederation, we had a crisis. We had an economic downturn, and things were kind of in the pits. Also, many of our own founding fathers had invested in or were actually creditors to the government, so they needed to get paid back. So if you actually read the Constitution through and through, there is a lot about them getting paid back or about the government paying its debts. So to those people, they say, aha, these folks, they were just after themselves. They were just after getting their money back. It's just a bunch of rich white guys just feathering their nest. That could be true. But you could also say, hey, yes, they took care of themselves, but they also took care of the country. Now, I went to high school in Texas, and I remember Deion Sanders, the Dallas Cowboy, would always say, if it don't make money, it don't make sense. So there's nothing wrong with taking care of yourself if you're also taking care of your country. But it's something to think about in terms of being a critical thinker in terms of our Constitution's founding. So let's talk about a little bit more about their background. What was in their mind? So maybe in their mind there was money. Maybe in their mind was some philosophy. So again, these were the elite. These were people who back in the 1700s went to college. You know, my grandparents didn't go to college, but these folk back in the 1700s had gone to college, like to Harvard or maybe to Cambridge or Oxford. And so they studied the great thinkers. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about political history. In chapter 1, we talked about the Magna Carta back in 1215. me go back even a little bit further. Before 1215 in the Magna Carta, rulers were seen as having a divine right to rule. Or think about Egypt and the sun god and the pharaohs, or just that God made that person a king, and because of that, that person could rule over you, and you could be subjected to that person's will. So in chapter 1, we talk about subjects versus citizens. Then we come to the Magna Carta, was essentially we have King John, who wasn't really doing that good of a job being a king. And so his lords, or his feudal lords, think about, kind of the medieval times. And actually, if you really want to get funny and think about Robin Hood. And think about Prince John and Robin Hood. Because that's basically the model. If you think about it, King John was the model for Prince John and Robin Hood. Disney's Robin Hood is who I'm talking about. But anyway, he wasn't doing that great of a job. And so his lords actually imprisoned him and said, hey, you need to give us some say in government, or you're not going to be king anymore. And so with that, we have the Magna Carta, which was seen as the first time that the people really had a say in their government. So after the Magna Carta, we have the Age of Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a period in which we were talking about I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself in my notes, but we were talking about an age of reason. And even before that, we have the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s. The 1500s, Protestant Reformation. What the Protestant Reformation was actually the beginning of the Protestant church, and that was Martin Luther saying, hey, I want to be free of the Catholic Church. I want to have a direct relationship with God. Now, I'm a Catholic. I'm not here to slam any Catholics, but that's just the history behind that. So you then had a whole Protestant movement of churches, and they saw that they could have a direct relationship with God instead of having to go through a priest or a church leader. Now, in the 1600s and 1700s, we're at the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was the age of reason, that man could think for himself. So think about all of this in terms of, we have Magna Carta, more of a say in government, we have more of a direct relationship with God, and then we have the age of reason. And so that makes you think the idea of having the divine right of kings is really going to become under attack. And then who do we have here? Chapter 1, we talked about Calvin. Not Calvin, I'm sorry, I was thinking about Calvin and Hobbes. We think about Hobbes, and we think about John Locke. Both of them thought that we could be independent, that we could be citizens. Hobbes was a little more pessimistic, Locke was a little bit more optimistic. So with Locke, we have the idea of self-government and social contract. So, John Locke. Key terms here, self-government, and social contract. So let's kind of set the stage here. John Locke thought that we all exist, again being an optimist, or at least that's how I kind of characterize him. He said we all exist in a state of nature. And this isn't a brutal nature like Hobbes thought about. This is actually kind of like a Garden of Eden. Like, this is a wonderful place. And we have the capability of taking care of ourselves. And in the state of nature, we have certain natural rights, like to life, liberty, and property. And we have rulers, or we have government because it's more convenient, it's more efficient. And we're going to have this person rule us, but we have a contract with our ruler. And so even though we have the ability to govern ourselves, we're going to pick somebody to be our leader. Maybe that we call him a king, maybe we call him something else, but that king has got to do, or leader, pharaoh, or whatever, has got to do a good job. And by doing that good job, I mean they've got to protect your natural rights to life, liberty, or property. And if they don't do that, you have the right to replace that ruler with somebody who does. So that's your contract. This person's got to do a good job to protect your natural rights, And also, some people say that the self-contract also includes protection for the rights of the underrepresented against the majority. Kind of ties into the idea of a republic that we've talked about before. And so, let's see here. So at that point, we're thinking about England, the Revolution. We've all studied different reasons for the American Revolution. Maybe they were economic, maybe they were freedom. Again, your book talks about that in a great bit of detail. What forms of government did we have in 1776? Did we have a democracy? Did a democracy exist? Actually, no. I mean, we had a democracy back in ancient Greece, but at this point in time, the entire world, there were monarchies. Maybe with some relatively limited power. It's like we have with England after the Magna Carta. But even then, with King George, we were not happy, and we thought that king had too much power. So what were we going to do? What were we going to invent that was going to be better? And so they took a lot of thought from John Locke's idea. And in fact, you can see John Locke's idea in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the National Archive says, I'm going to quote here, the Declaration of Independence, in this declaration, Jefferson expressed the convictions in the minds and hearts of the American people. The political philosophy of the Declaration was not new. Its ideals of individual liberty had already been expressed by John Locke and the continental philosophers, meaning basically the philosophers of the Enlightenment that I've just discussed. What Jefferson did do was summarize this philosophy in self-evident truths and set forth a list of grievances against the king in order to justify before the world the breaking of ties between the colonies and the mother country. And so, just to kind of remind us of what we have. So, I'm just going to read you guys the first paragraph. So, in Congress, spoiler alert, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature, this is John Locke. We're not quoting, but we're referring to John Locke, the laws of nature. So the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, requires that they should declare the causes which hold them, impel them to the separation. So, famous next paragraph. Behold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. These are the natural rights that John Locke was talking about. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, wait a minute. Locke talked about the pursuit, not pursuit of happiness, we talked about a property right. Well, some people say they wanted the Declaration of Independence to appeal to people who didn't even own property, to appeal to the masses. And that's why we talked about the pursuit of happiness. But you can see the influence there that Locke's ideas had. And he says here, you have the certain unalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The consent of the government. We have the right. We have the ability to govern ourselves, self-government. But we let you be a leader. So it's the consent of the people. The people are the one from which the rulers derive their power. It's not from some sun god or some other divine right. It's from the people, from the citizens. So again, this relates to the concept from chapter 1, where we are no longer subjects of the king, but we are citizens. We are the creators of the power for that king or whatever that ruler is going to be called. And so that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, It is of these ends, let me repeat that again, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. That's here, social contract, right here. So you see these ideas of John Locke in the Declaration of Independence. And so the colonies are united about this idea. The king has not been doing a good job. We have a right to overthrow him. We are justified in these actions. So, spoiler alert, you all know that we had the Declaration of Independence, then we had the Revolutionary War. Something that people forget is that war lasted for 8 years. 8 long years. But, as we also know, we won that war. So, what happens? We won the revolution. Now what? You know, sometimes you're united with all of your friends against a common enemy, and then you defeat that enemy, and then now you've got to get along with these folks. What are you going to do? How are we going to function? We all said that was bad, but what are we going to create now? Now, so at least for now, we formed the Articles of Confederation. I'm going to go ahead and move over here for the articles. Have a few notes here. Articles of Confederation. With the Articles of Confederation, this is what we operated under before the Constitution. So basically think we're under England's control. When we're not under England's control, we're in a loose collective with the other states in the Articles of Confederation, and then we eventually end up with the Constitution. So why didn't we stick with the Articles of Confederation? Well, a lot of people will say that they were a mess. And so they served our purposes during the Revolution, but after the Revolution, we needed more. And so we find that there are basically 2 main weaknesses with the Articles of Confederation, or maybe let's just say, better say 3. One, we didn't have a strong central government. So let me kind of go back and explain to you what is a confederacy. These are the Articles of the Confederation. So a confederacy is a form of government. I'll have this definition for you. It's a government in which the local units hold the power. And so think about it like this. I'm not going to do 13, but imagine these are the 13 states. The power resides in the states. The states have the power. And they give that power to a certain central government or body. Here, we just had a loose affiliation of the states. It had a legislative branch, but that was basically about it. You didn't have a central government, and people would say it's very weak. It's who had the power? The states had the power. And so, I'll come a little bit closer to the video here. Definition of confederacy that you'll see in your materials. It's a government system in which local units hold all the power. It's a system in which the legal power of the government is held by state governments. The central government has only those powers that have been given to it by those governments. The central government is dependent on the state governments for its existence. And so here, the Articles of Confederation, it was the system that loosely unified the new independent American states before the Constitution. So examples of confederacy, Articles of Confederation that we're talking about now, also Switzerland today, and then during our Civil War, we had the Confederacy in the South. And so if you really think about it, the South wanted more states' rights. They wanted the states to have more power, so they wanted to have a confederacy. They didn't want to have our form of government. So when you think confederacy, think that the states have the power. The states are the boss. Now, who's the boss of me? The states are the boss of me. Now, the other form of government that exists is a unitary form of government. Now, unitary government is the opposite. In a unitary government, the central government has the power. Central government. And you see this in a monarchy. You actually even see this today in England, even though it's a constitutional monarchy. You see this in France, where the national government has all the power and the states are just merely departments or branches of that power. So think about, you have your, like, Bank of America. Its corporate headquarters are probably in New York. So corporate headquarters are in New York, but it has all these different branches all over the country. And then you have branch offices. So the states are really just branch offices of the national government. And so the national government has all of the power. And so these are kind of the options that we have. And so they don't want to have a king. They don't want to have a unitary government where there's a king who's the boss. They want their freedom. In fact, these 13 colonies have thought of themselves as independent states. So they want to be a free Virginia. They want to be a free New York. They want to be a free, New Hampshire. They don't want to be unified. And so for them with the revolution, the most that they can do is the Articles of Confederation. But things start to fall apart. As we talked about before, we had the critical times. We had the economic crisis. And so how do we fix this? So we have no central government under the Articles of Confederation. And we also don't have the power to tax. No power to tax. And we have no power to regulate commerce. So let me define commerce to you, because many times in class I'll have students not know what commerce is. Now, commerce is basically trade or business. And so, for example, maybe you might want to be selling something to another state. Should you charge tariffs? We've been talking, in the news about tariff, wars that we have with China. Should we be treating that other state like another country, or should they get preferred treatment? How do we do this? How do we manage this whole process? How do we manage business? And so we kind of think that these are the three main weaknesses. Of the Articles of Confederation. And we're kind of, just kind of limping along. I'm not sure if that's a fair characterization, but that's kind of how history has it, that we're just kind of, it's not working out. And it's kind of going downhill. And things really reached a head in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion. So this is another date, 1786, Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shay had been a soldier in the Revolution. He was a veteran, somebody to be respected because he had fought for our freedom. But the economic situation after the Revolution was not kind to him, and he and a lot of other people were in a terrible bind. Very similar to, think about the credit crunch of 2008. Now, I know some of you may be too young to remember back that far. It was 11 years ago, 12 years ago now. It's really crazy to think about. But you might have heard your parents or other family members talking about losing their homes, having very tight credit, and it just being a terrible time. And the crisis they had back then was very similar. And so Daniel Shea and other farmers and other veterans wanted to have debt relief. They wanted the government to help them. And they actually took over some government buildings and basically wanted another revolution. And they had their philosophies behind them, or what they were arguing, were the same things that we had argued for in our revolution. So what's going on? And in fact, the Shays Rebellion really scares the people who are our founding fathers. You know, what have we done? Have we created a better society than we had under the king? Or are we in a situation of mob rule, where we're going to have the tyranny of the majority, and we're going to have all these hooligans take over our government buildings? Something has to be done. There, 1786. So summer of 1787, we have our Constitutional Convention. Ah, my goodness. Let's see if I can put this up. Here we go. Aha, 1787, Constitutional Convention. Now this convention was only authorized. I've gone through a lot of my notes here, so let's see here. Get through those here. The Constitutional Convention was only authorized to tweak or amend the Articles of Confederation. But was this meeting without controversy? No, in fact, it was very controversial. In fact, Patrick Henry, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, said this was treasonous, that he thought they're going to do something to create another king, and we fought a revolution against a king, and so these are people who are going against what we fought the revolution for. This was extremely controversial at the time. And so after 3 months of meeting in secret, which I can't even imagine doing that today, after 3 months of meeting in secret, they resolve certain issues. What did they end up with? So, let's kind of go forward. So, no central government. That was an issue. Well, how are we going to get kind of control over this mob? What do? We don't want to have a king, but we don't want to have mob rule. How can we kind of divide this up and fix this? What we do is we have a central government, and we have a compromise that's known as federalism, which we're going to be talking a lot more in our next class. But with federalism, we no longer have, I'll just kind of recreate this dynamic of power going to the central government from the states. But we also, so we don't have this, and we also don't have a system where the power goes from the central government to the states. So this is from states to central government, this is from central government to the states. How do we do to kind of do something in the middle? Do something that's never been done before? We have our federal system. With the federal system, our central government and our states are next to each other. They don't get their power from each other, they get their power from the Constitution. So under this system, the Constitution is the boss. The Constitution or the people. So that's why you hear on the news where people get all excited. You know, no man is above the law, not even the president. It's the Constitution that I'm talking about. Defending the Constitution, because it is the Constitution from which we derive all of our power, whether or not it's a national government or a state government. And so just for our purposes right now, realize that in this new system, it's not the states that are the boss, it's not the national government that's the boss, it's the Constitution that the people have created that is the boss. So we have that system with federalism. with our central government, we're going to have 3 branches of government. We're going to have, and I'm going to put these in order that they are in the Constitution. So, Article 1 of the Constitution is going to be your legislative branch. This branch is in charge of making laws. Article 2 is the executive branch. The executive branch is going to be your president and the bureaucracy. They are supposed to execute the laws that the legislature makes. In simple terms. Third branch is the judiciary. Judiciary is a fancy way of saying courts. This is the court system. Think of judges, the judiciary. And so they interpret laws, and later on, with Marbury versus Madison, they will even determine whether or not laws are constitutional, and we'll be talking about that later on. So we have a government, we have a central government, and it's really divided in 2 ways. One, the central government itself, the national government, is divided into 3 branches, and then its power is not absolute. Through federalism, it shares power with the states. Now, this may seem elementary to us, but that's not the way every other state does it, or every other country does it. In fact, in many other states, if we were a parliamentary system, like the UK, they combine their legislative branch and their executive branch together. So there are different ways to do this. But anyway, let's focus on ourselves. So here, problem, no central government, but we don't want to create another king. Talked about that. No power to tax. What do we do about that? The no power to tax, one of the very first things that we gave our legislative branch, if you read the Constitution, I think it's like number 1 or number 2, they say the legislature has the power to tax. So it has the power to tax. What about the power to regulate commerce? Article 1 of the Constitution gives the legislature the power to regulate commerce. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we got this power to regulate commerce. There were 4 major compromises at the Constitutional Convention. One of them is that one of them gave Congress the power to regulate commerce. One of them gave Congress the power to regulate commerce. And so let's talk about our 4 constitutional compromises. So this one, commerce, this was the Slave Trade Commerce Compromise. And I've got to tell you, slavery is a very distasteful part of our history, but it is part of our history. So we need to talk about it and acknowledge that. So the Slave Trade Commerce Compromise, what was that? The South wanted to keep importing slaves. The North wanted that to stop. The North wanted to have the national government regulate commerce. The South did not want that. So the deal they struck is that in order for the South to be able to continue importing slaves for a few more years, they would give the North the ability to control commerce for the entire country. So that's the Slave Trade Commerce Compromise. Now, interestingly, this Commerce Clause later on, and we'll be talking about this way at the end of the semester, Congress actually uses the Commerce Clause later on in order to enforce anti-discrimination laws. And so it's kind of interesting when you think about the history of why we even have the Commerce Clause in the first place to see how we've used it in modern times. But we'll talk about that at the end of the semester. So what else do we have? Speaking of slavery, we had the Three-Fifths Compromise. With the Three-Fifths Compromise, what are we talking about here? Well, we have a legislative branch. Our legislative branch is further divided. We have a House of Representatives, and we have a Senate. Let's make this a little better. The House of Representatives was considered the people's house. And the Senate were going to be kind of be the elder statesmen that were going to control those folks. And then to even get the House of Representatives and the Senate, we had another compromise, which is called the Connecticut Compromise. So I'm going to come back to the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise. So with the Connecticut Compromise, you had New Jersey and the small states that wanted representation to be equal for all states in this legislative body. In fact, it had been equal under the Articles of Confederation. So you could say, hey, now Rhode Island wants to have as many representatives in the legislature as New York or Virginia, which were highly populated states. And of course, Virginia didn't like that. So there was the New Jersey plan that was with the small states, and then you had Virginia plan, which large populated states wanted, and mainly kind of southern states. And what Virginia wanted, they wanted to have population, representation based on population. So New Jersey plan, representation should be equal for all states. Everybody gets the same number of representatives. Virginia is determined on population. Well, they come up with a compromise called the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, and that gives you one of each, basically. So we have the House of Representatives, that's based on population, and we have the Senate that is equal. So every single state in this country has 2 senators. You can have 50 people in that state, you're going to have 2 senators. You can have 30 million people, like California does, you're going to have 2 senators. Every state has 2 senators. House of Representatives is based on population. Some states have hardly anybody in them. Every state's going to have at least 1 representative. So there are some states who have such low population that they only have 1 representative. Right now in our country, we have about 1 representative for every 700,000 people. For California, that means we have 53 representatives. And so California has 53 representatives in the House of Representatives, and we have 2 senators in the Senate. So when we're talking about population in the House of Representatives, how do we count that population? How do we count that population when the southern states, many of them, half their population, if not more, was made up of slaves? Do we count the slaves? Do we not count the slaves? These are kind of difficult questions and kind of distasteful today, but it is what it is. So the compromise they came up with is that the slaves, each slave would count as 3/5 of a person. So that's why it's called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And so, let's see here, I want to make sure. So those are our major compromises that we have with the convention. So how do you design a government when you fear consolidation of power or another king? You have your separation of powers. You have your system of federalism. And then we also just have our written constitution, our amendment process. The fact that this is actually written down. So, as I set it out here, kind of written in the eye of history, this all sounds kind of good. We've been taught these are the problems and these are solutions. So this should be a slam dunk, shouldn't it? Shouldn't we get this approved? or was the Constitution itself controversial? So, as you can guess, the Constitution itself was controversial. And so, I get my notes here. Oh my goodness, I've covered a whole lot, believe it or not. And so, goodness, we are rocking and rolling, which is fantastic. Okay, I'm down to basically 2 notes. Double check. Ah. Oh, this is fantastic. So I'm basically down to 2 pieces of paper I want to talk to you about. So we have the Constitution. We have the draft. We come to the end of the Constitutional Convention. We have this framework. We've hammered it all out. It's all done. Okay, let's all go home. Well, guess what? Some people actually refuse to sign the Constitution. So, why would they have refused to sign the Constitution? Well, these are people who felt that the states' rights had not been protected enough in the Constitution itself. And these were folks that we called anti-federalists. So with our anti-federalists, we actually have people who they stood up 2 or 3 days before the end of the Constitutional Convention and said, we cannot sign this because it does not have a Bill of Rights to protect the rights of the individual against this central power, and the states don't have enough protection. Peace out. Good luck with this. The Federalists were like, hey, wait. We spent all this time. We got to do this. We're going to put this before the states. And they're like, okay, you can vote on it, but we're going to campaign against you. And so there's this kind of battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists as to whether or not the Constitution should even be ratified, whether or not the people should even approve it. In order for the Constitution to be ratified, we need to have 9 votes. And it was kind of touch and go there for a while. So let's talk about Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Key point here, and I will tell you we are coming to the very end of our class in those Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and then we'll talk about Federalist papers, so we are wrapping things up now. So key point here, Federalists, they are for the Constitution. They want the Constitution to be passed. The Anti-Federalists are against the Constitution. They think the Constitution's gone too far. We fought a revolution to keep from having another king. We're going to have another king. Please stop having another king. Okay. So, with Federalists, we have George Mason. And George Mason is the person, he and 2 other folks, there are a total of 3 folks who were there at the last days of the Constitutional Convention, said we're not going to sign it. Later on, kind of spoiler alert, Thomas Jefferson is going to be, I'm sorry, I apologize. I apologize. So George Mason, I'm so sorry. I was looking at the camera and not looking at where I was writing. So George Mason, and later on Thomas Jefferson is going to be considered an anti-federalist, but later on. They fear a strong central government. And over here, we have Alexander Hamilton. Who you guys may have heard of more recently because of the famous Broadway musical about his life. John Jay, and James Madison. And James Madison is really the person who's responsible for most of the text of the Constitution. And you're going to be seeing a video about this from the Annenberg Institute that I think is very good. And kind of just think of James Madison, I kind of think about him as like the Hermione Granger of the Constitutional Convention, where he had a plan, he was organized, he'd done his homework, but he really wasn't the most exciting person in the room. You know, other people get more kind of screen time, as it were. So these are your Federalists. And heck, you know, James Madison wrote the Constitution, so he's for the Constitution. And they fear mob rule. They fear mob rule. They want a strong government. And they actually kind of fear popular participation. Now, when I talk about popular participation, I'm talking about real people being involved, real people being, you know, having power in the government. And you're thinking, wait a minute, isn't that what democracy is? Well, let's look at the democracy that was created back in 1787. In 1787, the legislative branch, let's look at this. The legislative branch your House of Representatives was elected by popular vote. So that was popular vote. Your Senate was not. Senators were appointed or named by the state legislators until fairly recently, actually. So there was no popular election of senators. Then your president. Was your president elected by popular vote? Well, we do have a popular vote, but what really elects the president is the Electoral College. Then our judiciary. With the judiciary, are they elected? Now in California, our state judges are elected, but our federal judges are national judicial body. Those are appointed. They're appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So that is not a popular vote. So one criticism people had is, hey, this whole democracy thing you're trying to sell people, you're really talking about just the House of Representatives. And everything else is just a dictatorship or a way for the good old boys to have power again. So, different ways of thinking about things. Anti-Federalists feared a strong central government for the reasons we talked about. The Federalists feared mob rule. They didn't want to have another Shays Rebellion. They wanted a strong government. And they were kind of afraid of kind of this unruly mob or tyranny of the majority. These folks are pro-states' rights. These folks, again, want a strong central government. And they fear tyranny. They want protection for individual rights. They say, hey, there are individual Bill of Rights in the states that protect me from my state doing things to me. But there's no Bill of Rights for the national government to protect me from this new thing that we've created. Where's my protection? I need to have a Bill of Rights. And the Federalists are like, hey, we don't need to have a Bill of Rights. So Bill of Rights, not needed. They said, number one, the states have bills of rights. And number two, if we were to make a list of individual rights, maybe that could be seen as a limit. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about civil liberties. And so, this is the debate. This is the fight. Think about kind of an epic rap battle or something. We have the Federalist battle, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, Who's going to win? What is our country going to look like? Are we going to go back to a confederacy? Are we going to try something new and different? Is this going to last? Many of our founding fathers thought even if approved, this wasn't going to last for more than 10 years. So what are we going to do, and how do we talk to people about it? Well, this is back in the 1700s. So we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Instagram or Facebook or social media feeds. We had newspapers, and we had people talking about what was in the newspapers in your public houses. So how do they campaign? They campaign through writing essays back and forth about who was right and who was wrong. And so with those essays, and this is just kind of how, they fought back in the day. So just think about people just in the movies where they take their gloves off and throw them down, they have a full fight. Here, you write an essay, it gets pushed in the paper, published in the paper, and then it gets responded back. So think about, actually, I think maybe a rap battle is probably a good thing to think about in terms of what we would consider it today. Anyway, so we don't have a name for all the essays the Anti-Federalists wrote, but we do have a name for all the essays the Federalists wrote, and they wrote the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers are important for two reasons. One, they are historical evidence of what the people who wrote our Constitution said it really meant. It was written by James Madison. John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. James Madison wrote our Constitution, and he was there for the entire time. So the Federalist Papers are important, number one, for history. But they're even important today because we still look at them today for evidence as to what our Constitution really means, or how should we really be doing things consistent with our Constitution. So judges look at them, courts look at them, and in fact, even you might have heard in the newspaper or seen the news, even today, Congress and our government looks to them as to how we should be doing things. So I think I lost count with the news, with the impeachment, with different people saying, well, back in the Federalist Papers, somebody said this or somebody said that. So they are an important resource today. Okay. Well, I think that's enough. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. But I think based on the reading and the other materials, this should be a really good wrap up with what we're talking about in Chapter 3. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.